Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy will impact your bottom line long after the presidential polls have closed. On deck today, we're looking at all things to do with the economy. On top of cooling inflation, Trump raised the prospect of having a quote-unquote say in the Fed's actions. We'll see how that pans out. But this has really set off a debate between the Trump and Harris camp on economic policies. Harris is set to release her plan on Friday, and of course, still waiting to get the details of Trump's plan as well. IXIC Boltansky, BTIG's Director of Policy Research, will join us with his views on all that and more. But first, of course, got to introduce my co-star, Ben Werschkul. So, Ben, we've been trying to figure out what's been happening with the Harris economic policy here, the core policy, as well as some of the individual policies. What's on your note card this week?
Yeah, I've got two note cards for you this week because there's been so much economic chatter this week. This is my Harris card and this is the Trump card. One sort of level setting here, I think, to start things off that might help is a poll that I think we may return to a few times in this episode, which is from Financial Times and the University of Michigan. What it found is that Harris now has a narrow lead, 42% to 41%, on the economy. And needless to say, this is a real wild shift in the race from just a few weeks ago when Biden was still in the race. So that's kind of the background music of this week. And given that, we're seeing a whole lot of talk this week. As you mentioned, Harris is revealing her plan on Friday. And what she's going to talk about is very consumer focused. The big announcement she's going to make is about grocery stores. It's a federal ban on price gouging by food companies. So that's kind of the lane she's trying to get into among a bunch of other projects. This is going to be a new rulemaking effort that she's announcing and new enforcement powers for the FTC that could tackle a literal kitchen table issue for folks about prices. And then on the Trump side, he's also been doing a whole lot on this as well. He had a speech on Wednesday largely attacking Harris on the economy, but also making a little bit of news. He talked about a 100-day plan of his own to deputize his cabinet members to bring in to gather ideas on inflation and bring them all together and then act quickly. So we're seeing a whole lot of back and forth, and the kind of core issue here is inflation.
Indeed. I mean, people are waiting to really see some meat on the bones here. So we want to break some of this down by bringing in our guest, IXIC Boltansky, BTIG's Director of Policy Research. Welcome to Capital Gains. So first, want to start off with what we know so far about Harris's economic plan. Obviously, she gets the benefit of having some of the good parts of the Biden administration, whereas, still waiting to hear her proposals. What are some of your clients expecting in terms of the industries that would be most affected by a Harris economic plan versus a Trump economic plan?
Thank you for the invite. And I think that's a good question, and one that I think you're hearing a lot of folks around the street and in different circles trying to answer. From a foundational perspective, we don't think there is a lot of daylight between Biden and Harris from a policy perspective. I think instead what you're going to see is the Harris campaign try to highlight certain economic arguments that it believes are kitchen table issues, like Ben mentioned, or where it believes that they have a stark contrast with the Trump campaign. So I don't see major points of departure between Biden and Harris. Instead, I think it's a question of what her campaign focuses on amplifying for political reasons. And I think that case is what they're going to try to bring to the voter. And so, look, I think no matter how you cut it, some of the Biden administration's work on fees, which they've called junk fees across banking and other parts of the economy, has been wildly popular from a political perspective. And I think that's something that you're going to see on display soon as the Harris campaign rolls out its perspectives. And here it's focusing on grocery stores, right? I mean, you can't come up with more of a kitchen table item than the cost of groceries. And so I think that's that's one of the narratives that you're going to see over the next few weeks.
I'm curious your take on antitrust in Harris. One of the other details in her speech is mergers, and it seems like a very critical eye. In some of the preview material, the campaign has called out the Albertsons Kroger proposal specifically, and that kind of raises questions about her antitrust approach overall. Do you see any daylight there in terms of how she might approach it versus Biden?
Yeah, look, I think that at the highest level, one of the themes that the market is focused on is consolidation. If Trump returns, there's a belief that we will have a new thinking at the FTC. The FTC under Chair Lina Khan has embraced something that's referred to as new Brandeis thinking, or the pejorative, which is hipster antitrust. And they have tried to stop every large merger with some mixed outcomes. If Trump wins, the thought is that Lina Khan's thinking will be thrown out of the FTC. You'll have different folks at the DOJ, and we'll have a massive wave of consolidation in numerous industries. And typically that can benefit some of these boutique investment banks like Moelis or Evercore, and that's what you've seen in the market given their recent move. The Harris administration is not clear yet. We don't know what that would look like, because it's clear that she's going to embrace certain elements of Biden's view regarding competition. And you're seeing that with the Albertson Kroger commentary from her campaign. But there have also been very distinct signals from some of her proxies that she is not fully on board with Lina Khan's worldview. And this is evident most recently by commentary made by Maryland Governor Wes Moore. And so there is definitely some thinking within the business community and those on Wall Street that Harris is going to try to chart her own course here, where she is still going to be tough on consolidation, but not as tough as Biden. And I think that's going to be very interesting to see her walk that tightrope.
And we did see the Trump campaign coin the term Kamalanomics. A bit of a mouthful there, but obviously they're trying to at least label her and attach her to some of what they see as some of the unpopular policies. But then when you look at what's been happening with inflation moderating, obviously consumer prices still high. What is the danger of really already attaching that to policies that we still don't really have laid out yet?
When you look at the issues that animate voters, in swing states, it tends to be the economy, immigration, healthcare, abortion, democracy, and seniors issues. Trump in those states is plus 8 points on average for the biggest two of those, which are the economy and immigration. Harris is roughly plus 11 for all of the other ones. And so to me, it's really a question, if you want to answer who's going to win this election, my response is, well, what are voters going to care about when they go to the polls in the next few weeks? And, Pennsylvania early voting starts in mid-September or so. And so is it going to be about the economy and immigration? If so, Trump is well positioned. Is it going to be about those other issues I mentioned? If so, Harris is well positioned.
What do you make of that University of Michigan poll I mentioned at the top that shows a sort of narrow race in terms of who they trust on it? Do you think that's significant? And how does that change sort of what you're talking about in terms of amplifying the issues they need to amplify?
Yeah, look, I think when you make the rounds with Republican strategists in particular, I think what they have started to argue is that Trump should focus on inflation as an issue and try to downplay some of his commentary regarding universal baseline tariffs, because obviously introducing tariffs to imported goods is inflationary. And so I think that Republican strategists see inflation as an area where if Trump can focus simply on the cost of goods since 2020 and not highlight his very strong views on tariffs, that can boost Trump back to where he has been as the clear leader on economic issues when it comes to the polling. If he's unable to do that and Harris focuses just on choosing the parts of the Biden economic report card that poll well, then you're going to see more polls than just that one show her as a leader. So look, it's a question of whether Trump is going to continue in this tailspin where there's really no clear strategy, which is where he has been since Harris entered the race, or if they're going to come up with a coherent strategy between now and November 5th.
And Isaac, it's hard to get Trump off the path of some of this grievance politics. Obviously, he still has a lot in mind about how he was treated, by the Biden administration, how he sees tariffs as well. But then he's also accusing the Harris campaign of copying some of his policies. For example, the tax on tips. I mean, if you're going to copy a policy, is that really the one that you want to copy? Being that, the CBO has had some concerns about the realities of that.
Yeah, look, I think there is something that we need to remember, which is there is a chasm between the rhetoric from the campaign trail and the reality of policymaking. And there is no one of substance in DC who thinks that ending the taxation of tips is a good idea from a policymaking perspective. But I think they're going to throw out a whole lot of promises. And to that end, I think that when one of them is governing, the likelihood of the price tag on future action keeps going higher and higher. We already have $4.5 trillion in tax cuts expiring at the end of next year. Our base case at BTIG is that the vast majority of those tax cuts will be extended because there are no real deficit hawks left in DC. But then you throw on top of that new promises made from the campaign trail, even if they're far-fetched, and that suggests that DC is just going to continue deficit spending no matter who is in the White House. It's just a question of what that deficit spending is going to be on.
And Ben, I know that you've highlighted before that, this is still the period of sort of making those promises, but there is going to come a point where the rubber's going to hit the road. What's your take on some of the commonalities, at least, that we've seen so far between Trump and Harris on some of their policies?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that with Isaac that a lot of these are promises that we may not hear about after November. The tax on tips, the tax on Social Security is another one that there's a question mark. The one reason to think taxes are going to be a big issue in the coming year is that because of the Congress has to do something on taxes by the end of next year. A bunch of Trump's tax cuts are expiring at the end of 2025. So basically, Congress has to get a bill done. So I think there's going to be parts that are commonalities that we can see go through. The big one, I think, that's evidence in both the plans is extending the tax cuts for people under $400,000 that make under $400,000 a year. There's a real big price tag with that, and so whether it gets paid for is unclear. Trump wants to extend it for everybody. Harris wants to extend it for people under, and then add certain things like the child tax credit to it. But that's the one area of commonality between the two.
And certainly still a lot of uncertainties, but at least for now, we'll have to put a pin in things. Isaac Boltansky from BTIG, thank you so much for joining us on Capital Gains, and we'll be right back after this break. Welcome back, everyone. Excited to bring in another co-star, Shauna Smith, Yahoo Finance's anchor. Good to have you joining us today, Shauna.
Yeah.
And so we're going to get into the top story. Sorry, over there, interrupting your hello there, Ben. We want to get into our top story, though, because there's so much to cover, especially with economics under the microscope this week. And of course, Trump suggesting that he should have a say in what the Fed does. Ben, I want to have you set the scene here. Obviously, Fed is meant to be neutral.
Yes, exactly. And this is an idea that's been floating around for a while. And interestingly, months ago, the Trump campaign tried to distance himself from this idea. But about a week ago, at a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, Trump was asked about the Fed, and he directly said, I think the president should have a say in interest rates and monetary policy. That, needless to say, is a real big departure from how the Fed has operated for the last 20, 30 years, and would be a major change. It's an idea that's kind of circulated amongst Trump allies, but hasn't been expressed this directly by Trump himself. And it set off a whole week now of back and forth. Harris immediately, a couple days later, denounced it, said she would stand behind an independent Fed. And then J.D. Vance, interestingly to me, really doubled down on it. He called monetary policy a fundamentally political decision, which is for economists a pretty shocking idea. So this is a clear dividing line between the two that we're seeing, and I think we'll see a lot more of in the weeks ahead.
How are markets and investors looking at this, Shauna?
Well, I think they're looking at it as a real risk, and kind of just going off of what Ben was saying, it would be unprecedented in recent history just in terms of what exactly this would mean. And it goes back when you take a look as to why it isn't a good idea to politicize the Fed. Obviously, a lot of that carries or is based off of some of that risk that would be associated with it because of the tough decisions that the Federal Reserve has to make, especially in the face of higher inflation, something that they have faced over the last couple of years. Obviously, a president would think twice, maybe before sending the economy into a recession, just given the political implications of this. And this is something that I've asked a number of our strategists, a number of our economists on the shows over the last several days, ever since former President Trump made these comments. And I think consensus, obviously to no surprise, is the danger that this potentially poses. And some of the comments that stick out to me, one being from Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi, and he's put it quite simply. He said, it is a very bad idea. There is a reason that it isn't done like this because of those tough decisions that the Fed has to make. So obviously, it remains a priority, and it is something that economists and strategists think is huge and paramount to keep those branches very separate, and for the president not to have a say in Fed policy because of the real risk that could present here to the markets.
One additional thing that in reaction I've seen, Shauna, that I think is telling is the amount of people talking about the 1970s this last week of it. That was the time when the Fed chairman was a guy named Arthur Burns, Nixon was the president, and that was a time where politicization of the Fed was really paramount, and Burns talked about it in the years since. And we don't need to tell anyone about 1970s and inflation and how drawn out that was and how long it took to get rid of that. So that's a real kind of concrete example of how too much politics in the Fed can be problematic.
Yeah, exactly. And Zandy pointed to that as a reason as to why clearly that should be viewed as a warning sign here for the economy, because the Fed, or because the president would have a real incentive, you would think, to keep rates low, right? So obviously that could fan inflation, posing other risks here to the economy going forward. So any sort of involvement or say that they could have over the central bank, very much viewed, and I think it's consensus here, very much viewed as a bad idea at this point.
So, Sean, is this a strong risk that the investors see? We know that Trump was talking about, even as he was president, saying, look, I wish the Fed would act, and really trying to put pressure on them. How real is that risk for investors? How seriously are they taking it?
I mean, they're not taking it too seriously now. I think they've also learned that former President Trump flip-flops on a lot of things that he says. I mean, just going back to what we saw under the first term, obviously he was very vocal on what he thought that the Fed should do versus what we have seen in recent presidential history. But I think going forward, or at least how economists and how strategists are viewing this now, obviously it's something that they are going to speak about because of that recent commentary that they did get. But in terms of how realistic that threat is, obviously it's too early to even take that into consideration, given the fact that the race is so tight right now, and given the fact that we don't even know who is going to be elected in the White House come November.
And I want to shift gears here because we want to still talk about the economy, of course, expecting to hear from Kamala Harris on Friday about Kamalanomics. No, she didn't frame it as that, but the Trump campaign did. So we know that inflation, price gouging going to be a focus here. With this change, though, Ben, what do you think this brings to the table once people do get a bit more clarity? Because obviously, now that once you're sort of exposed to the good and bad of your policies, we will see perhaps some of the clearer divides between her and the Biden administration.
For sure. I mean, I think it's the kind of question we've been talking about this whole episode. Isaac brought it up, I believe, as well, which is, can she take the good parts of Bidenomics and take them as her own, but then distance herself from the bad parts? Two other things that her campaign is saying she's going to talk a lot about Friday. One is prescription drug prices. She's actually doing an event with Joe Biden Thursday on that, and then going to talk more about it Friday. And then the other big one is housing costs. And so there's a lot to sort of flesh out there in terms of how she'd approach it and how people think it will actually change their lives, and whether they will have a different reaction to it than they've had to Biden, which has been pretty negative for months now.
And Shauna, do investors care who gets the credit, whether it's Biden or Harris, especially when you look at some of the bumps we've seen in the polls?
They don't care who gets the credit. There seems to be a lot more nervousness and maybe trepidation around what some of the policies that former President Trump has put forward, specifically around tariffs, what that could do in terms of the negative side for the economy going forward. The fact that could obviously stoke inflation to some degree, and some of the pushback there, that has very much been the narrative. I think with Kamala, a lot of that remains to be seen. We don't have many details. A lot of it is reporting at this point, or more so viewed as maybe a continuation more broadly of what we have seen from President Biden. So in terms of how the markets is looking at that, obviously that would be a little bit more certainty. And we know the markets typically don't like uncertainty. So as they try to frame maybe what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like versus a former President Trump presidency, there might be a little bit more bias just in terms of that clarity that we could have surrounding what Vice President Harris could look like here in the White House. But again, I think overall the theme has been that markets don't like uncertainty. So any sort of certainty that we can get in terms of more clarity on what exactly their administration would look like, more clarity on some of those policies, is viewed as a positive here for Wall Street.
We'll certainly keep track of that before she speaks on Friday. Appreciate you, our very own Shauna Smith.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so much. Right, well, we know, as always, polls don't always tell the whole story and get us in the right direction. But this close to an election, we really want to dive into what the latest polls are telling us. So we want to take a look at some key polling from Yahoo correspondent Andrew Romano, who's joining us now from Los Angeles. So, Andrew, what are you focused on, especially when you're seeing from state polling?
Yeah, well, it's the swing states that I'm focused on right now. So in the first couple of days and weeks after Kamala Harris took Joe Biden's place at the top of the ticket, we saw marked improvements in her own favorability rating. So before she became the presumptive and now the official Democratic nominee, she had pretty bad favorable ratings, and those shot up as soon as she got into the race. So that was interesting to watch, but we hadn't yet gotten enough information from the swing states that are going to decide the election to say where the race stood. Now, a couple of weeks have passed, those polls have come in, and the shift has been pretty remarkable. So I'm looking at a list here, and Biden, when he got out of the race, was trailing Trump by 4, 5, 6 percentage points. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, all the key states. That was part of the reason why he got out of the race. Now, the Harris versus Trump polls show her ahead in all of those states except Georgia and North Carolina, and she's only behind by about 0.5 point in both of those southern states. That's a 6 to 8 percentage point shift across the board, and it's why she now is, we're a couple months out. We can't predict what's going to happen in the election, but she's the favorite at the moment.
Hey, Andrew, thanks for hopping on. One thing you noted in your piece that I found interesting was differences in movement between the so-called Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the Sun Belt states. How are the numbers there, or the changes in the numbers there, different, and what do you attribute it to? Are there any specific issues?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Trump remains relatively strong in the Sun Belt states. These are southern states, North Carolina, Georgia, southwestern states, Arizona, Nevada, but Harris is catching up with him as well there. So she's got a pretty clear lead across the Rust Belt states, and they're about tied across the Sun Belt. So what is that discrepancy? Well, there are different groups of voters in different states in different proportions, and generally those are what are going to determine the outcome. So Harris is doing pretty well with white voters, especially suburban, college-educated voters. Across the upper Midwest, places like Pennsylvania. But she's also increasing her margins, and this is where Biden was suffering a little bit with younger voters, with Latino voters, with Black voters, and that's part of the reason why she's catching up across the South and the Southwest. And so when you look into issues, and we can talk about this, things like immigration and the economy, where Biden was really trailing Trump by huge margins, Kamala Harris has jumped up there as well, and she hasn't even said exactly what she plans to do. It's because those voters who are sort of docking Biden points on the issues are now saying, well, they're going to give Kamala Harris a chance.
And Andrew, just quickly, because I know we are tight on time, but looking at this Financial Times University of Michigan poll, it's showing that candidates say they trust, in terms of who they trust on the economy, how much that has now changed with now the Biden-Harris, the Democrat ticket, higher now than it was before since Harris was announced. Why are we seeing this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's one poll. It's my job as the guy who tracks the polls to remind us that it's just one poll. I think it was 42% to 41% for Harris, so 1 point margin, well within the margin of error. But we are seeing across polls an improvement in Harris's numbers on the economy compared to Biden's numbers on the economy, and then, of course, versus Trump. And again, I think that is just people coming to Harris with more of an open mind than they had to Biden. They had several years of Biden. They had complaints about the economy, specifically about prices. And they're sort of saying, let's see what Kamala Harris can do. Maybe these are Democratic voters or swing voters who had decided about Biden, but aren't quite decided about Harris. So they're giving her a shot on it. It'll be interesting to see what happens when she rolls out her economic policy starting tomorrow.
Yeah, I remember that give them a chance mantra being what people thought when they were considering electing Trump for the first time. We'll see how that all plays out. Thank you so much for joining us, Yahoo News correspondent Andrew Romano. And of course, thank you as always to our very own Ben Werschkul. That does it for this episode of Capital Gains. We'll see you next time.